title of the second panel is called Connecting People and Places, Designing Transportation Systems for Smart Cities. And so we have 4 panelists, and it's moderated today by Miles Bryan, a reporter and producer of WBEZ. The other panelists are Mary Sue Barrett, the president of the Metropolitan Planning Council, Ron Burke, the executive director of the Active Transportation Alliance, Clayton Harris III, the executive director of the Illinois International Port District, and Leanne Redden, the executive director of the Regional Transportation Authority. Turn it over to you and welcome. Thank you.
We'll accept that.
Right. Sir, we'll take that. It's great to be here. I'm Miles Bryan. I'm a reporter at WBEZ News. And one of the best parts of my job, my favorite part of my job, is that I get to be out in the city all the time. Spend pretty much every day going to a different part of the city, engaging with different people on different issues. And something that I've gotten to see working at WBEZ is how the Chicago region, how the area's transportation networks affect us and how we affect them. Something I was thinking about coming in here is I've been interested in the growth of fulfillment centers, of warehouses in the south suburbs. There's a lot of jobs there. There's a lot of folks who need jobs, especially in the Southland, but it's really hard to get there, and there's not good transportation service there. So those jobs aren't quite as accessible to populations that might otherwise jump on them. But that's just the kind of thing that I think about. So before we jump into anything, I'm going to have everybody just say a little bit about who they are and what they do. Let me start with you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Burke, Executive Director with the Active Transportation Alliance. We're a not-for-profit here in Chicago that works to promote better biking, walking, and transit. We were originally called the Chicagoland Bicycle Federation. Some of you may remember that name. The mission expanded about 9 years ago to include advocacy around walking and transit as well. And the name was changed at that time to Active Transportation Alliance. So we're all about creating more multimodal communities because we know that cities and regions that are overly dependent on automobiles are generally not as healthy, not as economically vibrant, not as environmentally friendly, and ultimately, I should say, and also, it's important to note that when you force people to own a car to get to jobs or to get to school or wherever, you've also created a situation that's not equitable. And unfortunately, that's where we are in Metro Chicago still today. And so I wanted to just throw out 3 numbers right off the bat, just to kind of, actually, I want to take a step back, do a quick survey. So who got here today by transit? Raise your hands. Awesome. Okay, so I've done this before. I know Mary Sue's seen me do this before. So this is our reality check, okay? Only about 13% of people in the Chicago region get to where they're going by transit. 13%. Even in the city of Chicago, it's only about 28% use transit. How many of you got here by rail? Okay, all right. So you're even more in the minority, right? Because actually in Chicago, about half the trips by transit are by bus. So I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about how people get around the Chicago region. In the suburbs, for example, here's a number I want you to remember, 90%. So 90% of all trips in the Chicago suburbs are by car. 90%. Here's another number, 80%. That's how empty the typical car is when it's moving around. One person. You could hold 5, right? Plus some stuff in the trunk. It's at least 80% empty. Really inefficient. It's just not an efficient way to move people around, especially during rush hour. So we need it. So, and 28% of the region's population is in Chicago, which is great, but the rest is out in the suburbs. And the suburbs is, to a large extent, driving a lot of the problems, and has for decades now, that we just talked about in the previous panel in the city, right? The jobs have moved to the suburbs, to places where it's difficult to reach by transit. We are paving over the entire Chicago region to accommodate car travel in this auto-centric society. Most people never leave their homes without a car, not because they don't care about the environment or they don't want to be healthy or that they don't like to ride a bike. It's because it's so hard to get anywhere without a car because we've designed our communities around the car, right? And so our organization is all about trying to kind of change that. We're seeing a lot of progress in Chicago in particular, where more and more people are biking. Transit ridership is growing by rail, but it's going way down on the buses, way down, about a 21% drop in the last 8 years, for example, in terms of bus ridership. So we're seeing improvement. My organization tends to get categorized as the bike group, but we're about more than biking. We also support transit and walking, and we want to see a more multimodal city of Chicago, but also more multimodal transportation in the suburbs.
Hi, everyone. Mary Sue Barrett. I'm president of the Metropolitan Planning Council, and we're an independent organization that works across civic and community organizations with government at every level every day, and also with the private sector to make our region the most vibrant, equitable, and sustainable. And our view is that we're not putting the pieces together in the way that we could. We have many, many assets. We all know them well, especially when some big opportunity like Amazon comes along. We start talking about that more, but also a little bit of wringing our hands about why things aren't working. So I'm delighted to be part of an infrastructure conversation because that's been a big part of our agenda. So we're not part of government, but because we work with government every day, we hope we can bring a little bit of the inspiration, so we do research, the advocacy, the coalescing of voices, and also some of the demonstration projects that show, yes, it can be done here. And we do all of those things on a range of growth and development issues. And I'm bullish about our assets, and I'm agitated about what we're not doing well. And that's, I think, what our panel is going to have a chance to talk about.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Clayton Harris. I am the executive director at the Illinois International Port District. So let me take a cue from Ron. I was going to do this. How many of you all know that we have a port here in Chicago? Okay, so that's a good start. A lot of people don't. And when I talk to a lot of people about what I do, they're like, we have a port there? I was like, well, there's this great big water, body of water, you know, just right over here. And yeah, ships come in to and through. So as the executive director, I've been there for about a year and some change now. One of the things I've been tasked with is to maintain and increase the viability of the port. And depending on who you ask and when you ask the question, the definition of viability obviously changes. One of the things that is paramount in my mission in keeping the port and maintaining and growing the viability of the port is talking about infrastructure, incorporating transportation, logistics movement. You know, even with the panel before, you have to talk about the environment, the community, and the different aspects of life in which the port touches, impacts, or influences, which is all aspects of city, urban, suburban, rural life, because all commodities come to and through. I was asked, well, you know, if the port went away tomorrow, what would happen? I was just like, well, you know, probably eventually stop eating. But if that's not important, then we don't have to worry about it. So we talk about the exchange of commodities. We look at the movement of freight and the logistics between all modes of transportation. So the port, the Illinois International Port District, or the Port of Chicago, is probably the greatest multimodal facility in North America, and it's getting that back to and through, and how we interact with all aspects of life.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Leanne Redden. I'm the Executive Director at the Regional Transportation Authority here in Chicago. I know this is probably kind of an inside baseball crowd, but you know, a lot of people actually don't know what the RTA does. We don't operate a single bus or train, but I think as importantly though, we are tasked with we're sort of the parent company with CTA, Metra, and PACE. We are largely responsible for the planning, the funding, and some oversight responsibilities of the three operators. So we have sort of the great fun task lately of sort of balancing budgets. And you know, historically people have heard stories about, you know, the infighting and we don't get along. I can say right now we're probably at the most collaborative and cooperative space we've ever been in, and I've been just in the transit space for about 12 years now, and in transportation my whole career. And the challenge is that we're all, you know, there's just not enough money to go around, and I think that'll be a theme that'll we'll tease out over the conversation. But more importantly, I think bringing back to sort of the topic for today, I think transit is fundamentally important. Ron rattled off a whole bunch of statistics, so I won't repeat any of those. But we're the thread, I think, that really keeps a vibrant economy together, that weaves things together. I think we are sort of that connection for economic viability. There's a lot more we could be doing. I'm Fortunately, I think we have a really strong foundation and a great transit network. We're the second largest transit system when you put the 3 operators together in the country. And our region's history has been built on a foundation of transportation, and a large chunk of that was transit. And unfortunately, though, I think because of political and other funding issues, we've sort of turned a bit of a blind eye and sort of somewhat kicked the can. And so we've got ourselves into these funding dire straits that aren't just unique to transit, but they are certainly a big issue for us to deal with. And for us to move forward, as Mary Sue just said, sort of she wants to be bold and be agitated, and I can be very much like that myself. I'm usually told to calm down a bit. But it's frustrating because I think we've got some of the greatest people thinking collectively on the same track, and we just don't have some of the wherewithal to get some of the things done. And conversation and advocacy is going to be a really key part.
Maybe money might be an interesting place to start. This panel is called Designing Transportation Systems for Smart Cities, and I know that part of the impetus was, when it was being planned months ago, was President Trump had been talking about this massive infrastructure bill, and there's this refocus on infrastructure in this country and what kinds of things could come out of that. And in some hypothetical other present, we might be debating how that bill actually came together and what came out of it passing. Of course, it hasn't actually materialized in a clear way yet, but maybe we can sort of take that as a prompt. If you folks had the chance to weigh in on some dream huge federal, maybe combined with the state infrastructure bill, what would be your priorities, and what would you push for, and how would you use it to rectify problems you see in the way that your transportation systems are being funded or sort of misfunded? And maybe we could start with you, Leah.
So my first words of advice to the Trump administration would be it has to include some real money. And I'm very excited that they're talking about infrastructure. What I worry about is a lot of it's on the potential on the backs of private equity money, gimmicks, tax credits, those kinds of things. And there is still, especially in many aspects of the public sector, a very real need for real money. We already leverage the federal dollar, the limited federal dollars we have, and we need to sort of leverage more. We bring stuff to the table at the local level, so we're not just walking in for a handout. Plus, I also like to, and I've had conversations with the administration, that this isn't a handout. There is a return on that investment. And it really ties back to jobs and economic viability of a region. We need to do a better job of telling that story, not just us in our region, but across the country. It does have to be real money. It can't all be, we, unfortunately, the revenue that transit generates, for example, is the fares, and that goes largely into the operations of the system. We're not like a tollway where that money can sort of be leveraged into broader capital projects. We don't have as much of that spare cash to do some of those things. So that would be, I'll let the others talk about some of the other aspects.
Well, the Port District, so we're clear, we'll take anybody's money, right? So if it's given, we'll take it. We're in need of capital. The issue with what's going on federally right now is, will there be real dollars behind the rhetoric? So, we're going to take proper advantage of anything that can be, will be, or should be available. But one of the things that we have to make sure that we also realize is that normally with the federal dollars coming to and through, there has to be a local match that comes with it. And one of the issues that we're dealing with, if we're talking about finances, is also the ability to generate revenue locally. And that's an issue that we have. And we had that bill, House Bill 1797, that was going through that would have helped us with our debt equity ratio that we were able to get through the House and the Senate, but was vetoed by the governor. So we are looking at more fundamental and closer issues for finance and trying to be extremely agile and to think about multiple different ways that we can go. We have great partners in the city, the state, and the county moving through in the region because they recognize the international importance of the port and the Port Authority, and they also recognize, to Leanne's point, the revenue that is generated back from our operation. So the revenue that we generate let's just say in the tax dollars back to the state, we probably generate easily about $27 million annually on a minimum just in state revenue, and that doesn't account for the probably 157, I think, in federal tax dollars that go back. So when people start to look at what they are investing in And that's really what I have to make sure people understand when we go for grants and other funding, that this is not a handout, but this is an investment back into the city, the state, the county, the region, and what we do. So
I want to expand your question because the concept of waiting for Washington is not such a smart strategy ever, and particularly now, given this uncertainty. And I'd expand that to say same thing with the state. So we're in an era of self-help. That doesn't mean the feds and the state get off the hook with infrastructure investment. There is a clear case to be made on return on investment, especially when we coordinate water, sewer, housing, education, transportation investment. That kind of targeted investment, when we do that, we really see a ripple multiplier effect in community after community. One we gave an award to earlier this year was the community of Pullman on Chicago's far southeast side, a neighbor of the Port District. In Pullman, they have done a number of things, including extending South Lakeshore Drive, bringing in local employers like Method, the Whole Foods distribution facility, a number of job generating and workforce housing rehab, the whole gamut. And our quantification was that that community, because of coordinated investment and leadership, was outperforming by far their surrounding communities. This is not an easy community to turn around, but Pullman put all the pieces together. And on a big scale, that's what we're trying to do as a city and as a region. So we need the federal government as our full partner. I'll give you an example of self-help. So the Red Purple Line modernization is one of the top priorities of RTA and the Chicago Transit Authority. So it's been on our to-do list. By the way, the backlog of need, just so you have a number, is $43 billion over 10 years. That's just to catch up on the basics. It's not covering all of the important new stuff that we need to be talking about. So we need some new revenue sources for the taking care of what we've got and for the new expansion. So there was, at the tail end of the Obama administration, there was $1.1 billion that was available, had been available to this project. And it requires, as all federal dollars do, a local match. Wasn't happening, no state action. City budgets were under stress, clearly, CTAs. And so the idea of creating a zone, people sometimes call it a transit TIF. That's not exactly an accurate description, but it's a zone around the Red and Purple Line North Side extension, North Side modernization rather, that is allowed to capture incremental increases in real estate. One of the concerns about TIF, legitimately, is that it redirects growth of the property tax that would have gone to Chicago Public Schools for that period of 23 years. This one carves out the Chicago Public Schools. So it takes away that issue of you're hurting the schools, and you're adding the benefit of you're helping transit. So I think that this kind of approach, which was actually enacted a year ago, was utilized to access those dollars, and now that project is next phase moving forward. So we have to explore more and more of those kinds of things, and then say to Washington, look, we've got a track record. You've got, Tollway's done a bunch of great projects. RTA has done. We have a crisis of confidence, really, that if the dollars come, that they can go to good things. Mm-hmm. So I look to the feds, but I also, think we have to look at ourselves and say, what are the next mechanisms to capture growth in the marketplaces and in the sectors that are changing for our region. And transit needs sustainable revenue. All of our transportation needs sustainable revenue, not this boom and bust capital cycle.
Ron, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Mary Sue's right that we have to look more and more towards local funding sources to really support ourselves. Even during the Obama administration, which was relatively friendly towards transit, for example, even back then we were not especially optimistic that there would be more money flowing to Illinois and Metro Chicago, and I think that's even less likely now under the current administration. So, and also, it's, again, from our perspective at Active Transportation Alliance, we're very skeptical about highway expansion. I've got an op-ed I think it's in the Sun-Times today. You check it out. All about how highway expansion just really doesn't relieve congestion in the long run. It exacerbates our car-dependent problems that I talked about earlier. And we should really be spending that money instead on things that do work to relieve congestion, create transportation equity, improve the environment, so on and so forth. Now that's a hard task because, just like federal and state agriculture policy is hardwired to grow corn, federal and state transportation policy is hardwired to grow highways. And this is just the reality that we live in. I'm hoping that CMAP, our local metropolitan planning organization, as part of the GO-TO 2050 process, will get on board with this notion that we have to get away from highway expansion, suburban sprawl, and the status quo. That we have to really look to new ways of doing things, and that will involve some local funding sources like Mary Sue talked about. If you look at Denver, Los Angeles, they've all taxed themselves to expand and improve their transit systems. We need to for sure lobby hard for federal and state money, that's absolutely true. But we're going to have to find some new local revenue sources to really grow transit and just to maintain the stuff we have already.
I want to follow this idea of investment the next bit. I think folks, myself included, don't tend to think about some of the transit systems we use unless they're either A, there's a big expansion or project on the horizon, or B, they're busted and the train doesn't come and the road has a pothole. But I don't often have the thought of, man, I hope we're adequately funding Blue Line renovation so that it continues to run. But that's a huge issue, right, for anybody working in transportation is maintaining what you have and making sure it's up to snuff. But I also imagine that can be, balancing that can be difficult, which is sort of my next question, which is, when you look to the limited funds that you have, the limited funds that will be coming in, and also the future of whatever sort of networks you're involved with, and making sure that they're relevant and people are engaged with them in this area, how do you try and balance maintaining with what you have with, say, an exciting new project? And maybe we could actually start with you, Ron, because I don't know how that comes up for bicycles.
Right. Oh, well, bikes are easy, relatively speaking. It's so inexpensive. I mean, seriously, the cost to build out, for example, so there's a lot of new bike lanes, as you've probably noticed, in Chicago the last 7-8 years in particular. And I haven't seen the most recent update, but it was, I think somewhere in the order of like $25–30 million to build out more than 100 miles of advanced bike lanes, along with a number of other amenities to promote cycling. And that's just like a rounding error, for your typical highway or transportation projects. So it's relatively easy to do some of these bicycle projects. Often the main limitation will be just political, and a big part of our job at Active Trans is to help do the organizing, the mobilizing, to bring out the folks who really do support these projects and kind of do the education and the encouragement to bring folks around. I think we survived the bike lash, we called it, back in 2011. Some of you may remember it, with certain Tribune columnists and others just railing against what's going on, and I still hear a lot of complaints about cyclists, and we get that. But the good news is we're creating more order on the streets. We're starting to see people in cars, people on bikes, learning how to coexist better. The numbers are growing quite quickly. The more difficult task is funding transit, making sure that we're actually maintaining what we have, while at the same time not just ignoring the need to expand the system as well, even though we recognize that today it's hard to think about how to pay for that, right? But we also know that transportation projects take a long, long time to plan and develop, and the funding environment that exists today will certainly, we hope, change and improve down the road to the point where we can build some of the new projects that have been discussed.
Leanne, maybe you could go next. I know this is a big issue for planning RTA into the future.
Yeah, so I mean, probably 5–6 years ago, we really we basically said, no new expansion. We just don't have, even though everybody wants shiny, bright, and new, we just don't have the financial wherewithal, and it's fiscally irresponsible if we sort of turn our back on the existing infrastructure that we have. The hard part for us is telling the story and selling the story about, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a switching system that nobody sees. And that infrastructure is old, it's expensive, and so I think the service boards are doing a much better job, I think, about explaining some of those. It's about reliability and getting more trains through a signal or a switching area to enhance and try and turn these issues into customer-facing conversations. I think the service boards, CTA, Metro, and PACE, have done a pretty good job too in the last several years. Even though they're taking care of the existing infrastructure they have, they very much kind of, I think, initially started their focus on customer-facing aspects of that. So you're seeing new rail cars, you're seeing new information systems, you're seeing real-time information, station improvements. So some of those customer-facing things, so people can, that they are more tangible to the average rider. And now we've got the tough, and I always say the tough and less sexy stuff, the invisible stuff that we have to fund and pay for. So it's bridges, it's signals, it's track. And we just don't have enough money. I mean, Mary Sue threw out the big number of the backlog, but I mean, we should be spending $2 to $3 billion a year just to maintain the existing infrastructure we have. And yes, with that, you get a few nice, shiny pieces to it, but it's not really drastically, it's not expanding anything. And we're spending about $800 million a year. And that's all the money we have. And that's even cobbling together some of the creative resources out of sort of looking forward on TIF and some of the value capture concepts. So it really is a cobbling together of all these pieces that really just present almost insurmountable challenges sometimes. And I think what we have to do is kind of peel it apart into small bite-sized chunks, sound bites sometimes, so you can get an elected official or the general public to kind of understand how we're chipping away at this stuff. But again, keeping some of these smaller, you know, the Ventra app and things like that. I mean, the real-time customer information. I mean, I travel the world and the country, and we've got some pretty good things here. People tend to think everywhere else is better, but I actually think we've got some pretty good features that we take for granted sometimes.
A little bit of a contrarian view, which is unusual because Leanne and our agencies work together a lot.
It's the point of the panel, though.
Exactly. I think that we suffer from Midwest modest.
Yes, absolutely.
We think, let's just focus on, the knitting and the maintenance, and we know it's not sexy, but let's try really hard to sell it. Not working. So I think we have to blow it up and say, we're going to tag along all that maintenance, which absolutely has to come first, has to be done, has to be funded, needs reliable revenue, and we have to get people excited about what's coming next. To go with Ron's statistics earlier, we have way low transit ridership and threats from shared services like Lyft and Uber, which we don't fully understand its impact on transit. But the central business district still, when you look at the total incoming flow of people, 66% get there by transit into the loop. And we would absolutely not have a loop if we didn't have this multi-service transit network. And entities like Google said they came to the West Loop because there was this new Morgan Street station. So we've brought on board two new stations. They were actually both designed by Carol Ross Varney, the Cermak Green Line and the Morgan Street station, near South, near West. And you see how it supports new job centers, mixed-use centers. So we have to tell people, what are the next 5 upgraded metro stations? What are the next 5 new infill CTA stations? What's the next bus rapid transit? We've been talking about it on Ashland, let's do it. What's the...
On North Lakeshore Drive.
Lakeshore Drive, multimodal, dedicated lane. I mean, there's some big ideas, they have big price tags, and if we tell people that's the benefit, I believe that's why Denver and Los Angeles and other places got it done. So we, a few years ago, formed a coalition called Accelerated Illinois, and one of the things I've been looking forward to is to share with this audience today is that we're committed to getting it back from kind of pause mode, which we've been waiting for the budget pension issues to work their way through, to more active mode. And I can't look in my crystal ball to say whether 2018 is the year that we can get something done at the state level and get some regional resources, but we have a gubernatorial election, and we have a lot of candidates. And we have to educate all of them about what we must have, because this is the slowest growing city, region, and state. Slowest of any one. So infrastructure has been our calling card. We have to think beyond maintenance. We have to think about something big and bold that's going to put us back on the path of growth. So I think infrastructure can be exciting.
Real quick, so actually, sort of to piggyback on what Mary Sue just said, we're actually doing a 5-year plan right now, and the hope is to actually have an investment plan, and I call it an investment plan very specifically, and there's really 3 three key goals that we want to walk away with, besides a list of actual projects that we want people to sort of rally and get behind. But it's, delivering the value on that investment, building on the strengths of the existing network, which sort of crosses between sort of the maintenance, but thinking about the future, as well as staying competitive, because they're really three key things that I think the landscape is changing around us, and we have to be responsive. But we have a document that we can use with the public, with the media, with legislators, so we've actually got something that people can actually rally behind and sort of put the puzzle pieces that I think Mary Sue referred to in the beginning together to actually try to get some of these projects done.
Clayton, you wanna weigh in?
Well, sure, yeah, and I guess to be a little bit more contrary to the last couple of things that were going on, I don't deal with public transportation. I deal with transportation that affects the public. So it's the other way around. So what we need to do is we have to invest in our infrastructure. We have to go back and look at the deferred maintenance aspect of it. So when you talk about, the Metropolitan Planning Committee, when you talk about the Regional Transportation Authority and active transportation, and you talk about bicycles and different things that you all see or interact with regularly, I get it. But the interaction, nobody's coming to hang out at the port. Not really.
I do
Right. You should come down. It's not. But the issue is when people picture a port in their mind, they're probably picturing a West Coast or an East Coast port, and they think about containers being stacked up and gantry cranes and all this good stuff. And we're not that. We're a break bulk port. And so we deal with steel ingots and commodities that are on the ground and everything. And I had one guy, he came up to me, he's just like, we're parking cruise ships at your port or at the port. And maybe he didn't know I was the executive director. He's like, have you ever been over there? He's like, it's a junkyard. I was like, well, I don't think I'd call it a junkyard. And he's like, but have you ever been there? He's like, it's scrappy. I was like, well, my office is right there. And he's like, oh, well, I mean, I was like, it's all right. The issue is people have seen the port, but they've never come there and looked at the port. So when you talk about this and this interaction, sometimes if you just see the port and you see the failing infrastructure that we have there, you might picture it as a junkyard. I tell people we're classically Chicago. There are parts of us that don't look pretty, but we get things done. It's just like Chicago. Hey, we can do this, right? And we're working on this aspect of it, and that's kind of where we are. But for us, the investment has to be in the deferred maintenance, because everyone's like, well, you need to grow to generate revenue. We need revenue to grow. So that's the conundrum. So I get it and appreciate what Ron is, and he's right. He's like, well, it's bicycles, it's relatively easy. You talk about, well, we have to do front facing. You talk about the different aspects that people look at. Well, mine's hard as hell. I gotta balance everything, or I have all these balls up in the sky at the same time, and the goal is to get them to land at the same time. Because if one lands or doesn't land at the same time as the other, everything, not everything because they hired me for a reason, but it could fall apart. So
you folks all have the task of trying to maintain your networks or the port, trying to grow, limited funds, and you have to make your case, like Clayton was just talking about. So maybe before we move on, I could just ask, do you have a moment that you remember of breaking through to somebody who controls the purse strings? Maybe we can start with you, Clayton. It seems like you might have the hardest task.
Well, I thought we did it. We had House Bill 1797. Nutshell, this bill, when people describe it, they're like, well, it's just a loan forgiveness bill, and it's a lot more than that. But if you boil it down, I'll accept that. The port carries about $30 million in debt, and this bill would have alleviated $15 million. Basically, there was kind of a loan. It was really more land for anticipation of containerizing given to the port, $15 million by the state about 39 years ago. Containerized never came here. It was recognized about 38 years ago that this wasn't going to happen. And about 36 years ago, Capital Development Board wrote it off. So they were like, the state's never going to get this money back. So for the last almost 40 years, the port's been carrying a $15 million debt that we've never made a payment on, nor been required, so we're not in default for $15 million. Now, when I go to a bank or if I want a bond, And they're like, hey, what's this $15 million debt that you haven't made a payment on in 40 years? Don't worry about that. And they're like, no, we are worried about that. Right, and I get it, right? It's like your own home. I told you, when I get excited, I start to talk fast. But I tell people, I'm not talking fast, you're listening slow, so keep up. So we got this bill, and then we come through. So this bill, people agree on, okay, it'll come back, it'll erase the debt. So I explained to everyone, it doesn't create a $15 million hole for the state. It was already written off, and it doesn't enrich us, because people are like, well, you're just going to get $15 million. No. It just allows us to erase a number so that maybe a year from now, I can go talk to someone without them laughing. So my aha or breakthrough moment, right? Get down to committee down in Springfield. They're laughing. Oh, it's very audacious for you to come before we had a budget and ask the state to forgive, $15 million. I was like, one of my favorite authors had this book about the audacity of hope. So I'm hoping that you all listen to what I'm saying. So we get it out of House committee, get it on the floor. We have the debate in the House floor. Passes the House. Get all these calls. They're like, how'd you do that? I'm like, it goes over to Senate committee, almost the exact same thing. Get it out of committee. On the Senate floor, massive debate. People who voted against it in committee ended up voting for it on the floor. I was like, we did it. Very bipartisan, very, very bipartisan. It's great, everyone sees it, and then the governor vetoed it. So my breakthrough moment was, and man, the House ball, the Senate ball hit the ground before the gubernatorial ball did.
Leanne, you talked about having to put things into sound bites. Are there any that have been particularly effective any time you've broken through?
I guess I don't feel like we've had the success at the state or the federal level yet on sort of an en masse basis. And it's really frustrating. I mean, isn't this the city of broad shoulders? Where did its moxie go? And that's sort of to build on Mary Sue's point. It's frustrating. I think we've had success at sort of small and individual decision makers. I kind of like to feel like we've actually had some success in the family. With our 3 service board operators, it's almost a sort of, sometimes I feel like it's almost a war zone mindset. It's like they've been so beaten up, so beaten down, and there's been so little money for so long. I mean, we haven't had a state capital program since 2009. Right. And even some of those monies were never realized. So it's sort of this, like, just cobble together what you can so the buses and trains keep running. And it's a real, it wears you down, that mindset for so long. So I think the fact that we're actually to the point of doing this plan, this 5-year plan, which will have projects in it, for them to actually stop, sort of, to segment the conversation about what am I just going to do with this 800 million or my slice of that 800 million from a year-to-year basis versus if we had 2 to 3 billion a year, what would we do? And tell a story around that. And they're finally, we're all collectively, because we are a family, sometimes dysfunctional, we love each other and we hate each other sometimes too, but that's largely because it's hard for us all to get along because there's so many challenges. But I think that's my sort of small breakthrough for now, and we hope if we can stay together and get that plan, then we take that on the road and then start just chipping away. I don't think there's any I don't see any sea change politically, either at the federal or at the state level, to really sort of be able to just kind of run in. The other point I keep making to people is, what are we scared of? We've got nothing now. So what do we got to lose, right? I mean, if we get something more, they're like, well, what if we don't get that? And then people have expectations. I think we have to raise expectations to keep the pressure on to actually do some things.
Yeah, outstanding.
Mary Sue?
Yeah, the job's that big, for sure. I think that there are lessons from the 30 states that have raised sustainable revenue, dedicated source, since Illinois has dealt with this. So it's, we're being left in the dust. And they all look a little different. In Denver, which we've referenced a few times, it was really expanding transit on a regional basis. And it was about, they called it fast tracks. So it was about jump starting, and Los Angeles used a similar mindset of like, let's come up with dollars so that we can do what we have a dream or a plan that's been adopted for 30 years. We're going to do it in 10. So this idea of accelerating so that you start to get the job benefits. And I do think that theme is clearly one to lead with. Yes, sustainability. Yes, equity. But I'm talking about for everyone. And that kind of job boosting is what is clearly needed with our economy. Not in the sense that it usually is. You see a road builder voice or an operating engineer voice, and it starts to look like special interest. For too long, those have been the leading voices for advocacy. So I think all of us, especially organizations like the Active Transportation Alliance, are trying to very much broaden that. We use some mobile technology when we were forming Accelerate Illinois just to get people to submit pictures and videos of their commute horror story. And I mean, they were fascinating. And they made for really interesting fodder of like, what's making you angry? Send us your bill of that, that repair for your axle that cost you $650. And so that's what people want to talk about. What's the benefit? If I have these enhanced transportation options, well, then maybe I'm not going to get dinged with a $20 late fee for my kid's daycare center because the reliability wasn't there. It's not just about the big projects, it's about the quality of life impacts, and telling that story, I think we could do a much better job.
I have two quick the question is breakthroughs, examples of breakthroughs, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I have two quick stories. One related to transportation. So back when I worked for the American Lung Association, we were advocating for legislation to require diesel trucks to have their exhaust tested, just like cars do. It was a big complaint back then. It still is. It's gotten better. And long story short, we were doing tons of organizing and working with lots of different groups. And the Illinois Trucking Association was not pleased. I was being threatened. I was being pushed, literally, physically pushed around outside of the committee hearing rooms. We brought down some high school kids who had done visual inspections, and they were awesome, sharing their results, and the state senator just shouted them down, and they were like, ooh. The story, though, is later that day, I was called into Speaker Madigan's office, and he said, I'm going to sponsor your bill. Boom, done. It passed. That was cool. That was a breakthrough right there, because he said, this is something that everybody supports except for the Trucking Association. We're going to do this. And so that actually happened a long time ago. The second story is more recent, when we met with then candidate Rahm Emanuel, and Mary Sue was part of this. We had a sustainable transportation platform that we were taking around to all the mayoral candidates back in 2010-11. And we were talking about protected bike lanes, and we asked all the candidates to commit to 100 miles of new protected bike lanes during their first term. And we were sharing photographs from Portland, and I was explaining to Rahm Emanuel that Portland's way ahead of us. We really need to catch up, and his response was, I'm going to paraphrase here, screw Portland. Screw Portland, we're going to show them. And
I used to live in Portland. It's a nice
there you
place.
go. Yeah. Anyway, so he took that commitment for real, and a lot of progress has been made since then. So that's just an example of where you had a candidate who was already on board, and it was just a matter of kind of giving him the right information and helping him. And we spent the last 7 years really working with the city to build out that bike lane network.
So part of, I imagine, you folks' jobs as transportation planners is pushing the city towards a direction the direction that you believe is the best place for it to go, to making it a smarter city, like this panel calls it. But there's probably the question, and a question I was thinking about is this sort of chicken or egg phenomenon. Like, how do you bring people along with you, and how do you make sure that they're with you enough that they sort of take to what you're trying to give them? And so maybe to phrase that question a little bit more specifically, like Ron was just talking about, bike lanes are an issue in Chicago, and there's been this sort of back and forth over the last few years of, the bike lanes are created to facilitate more biking, and then drivers and people who live in those areas sometimes push back. Sometimes Tribune columnists push back because they lose parking spaces, the roads become more congested. They aren't able to do things the way they've always done them. And so the way I'd put this question is, do you push towards where you think the data and studies show we should be going, and then hope people catch up? Do you wait for them to be ready? How do you find that balance? And we can start with you, Ron.
Well, what we found is that when you lay out all the facts, people generally get on board with improvements to we refer to these as complete streets improvements. They're not just bike lanes. And in fact, it's much more effective to talk about and to really design the street changes to be more holistic. In other words, not just around bikes. You want to go in there and really redesign the street in a way that makes it safer and better for everyone. And often putting in a bike, not always, but often putting in a bike lane is part of that more comprehensive approach, right? So, because a bike lane will not only create more order on the streets, so the bikes know where they belong, the cars know that they're over here, so on and so forth, but it also will slow the cars down. You know, on most Chicago streets, you're not going to average in a car more than 10, 15 miles per hour, no matter how fast you go between the red lights. Right, we call this racing to the red. It does no good. You're not going to get home any faster. But people go flying 40 miles per hour up to the next red light. And so the bike lane will actually help slow those cars down. And you can also couple it with better crosswalks and countdown timers and things like that. So generally speaking, you want to, because not most people don't bike, we know that. So you want to talk about how we can redesign the street in a way that makes it safer and better and more orderly for everybody. That needs to be the approach. And what we found is that generally, that works. People generally get on board with that. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're taking out parking, that's always going to be controversial. Most of the bike lanes that have gone in Chicago haven't done that.
Leanne, does that come up with the RTA?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ron's touching on sort of that complete streets and taking a holistic philosophy on things, and we absolutely support that, and gets to some of the areas that we don't get control, like land use, and that are really fundamentally important to the success of any of these other bigger investments. Sort of back to also your original question, I think I have 3 words: millennials and baby boomers, because I think those ends of the demographic spectrum are really going to drive change, and I think they're the audiences that just who they are and where they are at in their phases of life are actually huge opportunities, I think, as well as for us to sort of preach to, if you will. I mean, they're preaching back to us, actually. But, you know, they're an audience that are receptive to, you know, the shared economy, different ways of moving around, sort of on both ends of the spectrum. And I think they're audiences that are, I think, very important for us as we move forward.
I think if the advocates get accused sometimes of being preachy, I think that is unfair, because really the common denominator here is choice. And when you connect with people about choice, Complete Streets is about giving people more choices. My office is at Adams and Dearborn, where there's that 2-way Dearborn bike path, and people were just, you know, agitated about that when first implemented, property owners as well. And Dearborn's throughput is just as good as ever before. It's safer. You know, people don't necessarily think about the fact that streets are for all modes, and that's what the Complete Streets mindset does. Lakeshore Drive, certain times a day, carries as many people on buses as in cars, and yet the debate too often about North Lakeshore Drive redo is about, you know, well, we got to maintain, you know, we can't possibly talk about a dedicated lane for transit because we got to help people get from the northern suburbs into the city. We got to help all people get around, and I think if we're embracing that and then telling stories along with data, that will be much more effective in saying, we're actually trying to give you what you want. And the other piece I wanted to just interject is that this is within the environment that today is changing. Add into that autonomous vehicles. And we have a huge new dynamic about how we're going to be using our public way.
Clayton, you want to add?
Well, sure. Complete Streets means a little bit different for us at the port. So we have dirt roads. So Complete Street would be paving. Right. So our deal, to the extent that I'm relevant in this question, is the interaction between the different modals. So our main drive at Lake Calumet, at least, is Butler Drive, and then there's rail that goes straight down the center. And then we have extremely heavy truck traffic that comes to and through. And so those 3 modes right there, and then we have regular traffic that comes through. And then on the other side of the transit sheds are the barges. So those modes, and keeping those together, that's our complete street aspect of it. But we do have dirt roads.
So as we move towards the end of our time, I wanted to bring up a theme that the last panel talked about a lot, which was how do you get everybody involved in these decisions and make sure you're sort of thinking about the community in general. And just a quick story here. Before I was a reporter at WBEZ, I was a reporter in the state of Wyoming. It's very different place. But the story I did there that sort of stayed with me that I think about a lot is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a couple years back, they moved the DMV. So the DMV had been in downtown Cheyenne, just a normal building. Cheyenne's only 60,000 people, but it was as dense a part of Cheyenne as it gets. And they moved it to a bright, shiny new building. It's huge, on the side of the highway. No sidewalk and no bus. And the story I did was I met a bunch of folks who actually were living in a homeless shelter, sort of people who were on the margins of Cheyenne society who couldn't get to the DMV, they couldn't take the bus, they either had to walk on the side of the highway or maybe try and find a ride, and it created a lot of problems for them because you need an ID to get a job. There's a lot of reasons you need to go to the DMV that maybe you don't think about until you can't get there. And the planners just, it had just not factored into their decisions because that was not the group of people that came into their mind when they thought about who they were serving. Everybody else had a way better DMV experience. And so I just want to sort of put this out there and see, if it brings up any thoughts about how in each of your jobs you think about catching the perspective that you might be predisposed to miss. Maybe we could start with you, Mary Sue.
Transformative project and effort we've been involved with probably many of you and organizations you're involved with. It's called the Cost of Segregation. We've been working with the Urban Institute, and it's about bringing an equity of opportunity lens and understanding the cost of our current patterns. We looked at places where big and diverse, more so than Cheyenne, and that were at the average on segregation, economic and racial segregation. So think of places like Raleigh-Durham, Houston, Atlanta. And how did they fare compared to here? So we found that if we were like them, we would have $4.4 billion more in annual income, which is a gross regional product impact of $8 billion, 83,000 more bachelor's degrees, and 30% fewer homicides. So you ask yourself, this is the status quo, and what does this have to do with transportation? It's because we don't bring this equity, inclusion lens to every decision we make, and we need to do that with transportation. Credit to the Secretary of IDOT, who used to be the head of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, Randy Blankenhorn, who you'll be hearing from, for bringing a criteria-based system. If we did that, we would look at facilities like the Port District, parts of the Regional Transportation Authority's network, and say, well, that is more deserving and should be a higher prioritization because it hits multiple pieces. And I think that that's what happens when you site a facility in the wrong place. It's far more than the homeless population that was inconvenienced. All those people who transact business through downtown Cheyenne, it is more inconvenient for them too. It's not all about parking, it's about services and choices. So if you don't have a system to ask yourself those questions, you don't ask yourself about what's the fair differential affordability that we should build into our next funding piece. Remember Governor Blagojevich putting the free fare for seniors out there? Crazy, no means testing. And then a number of senior citizens came back and said, we didn't want this. We want to support our transit system. But we don't provide a discount for transit fares other than for students. So these are the things we have to grapple with and bring into the system, and I think that community dialogue is going to drive those changes.
Leanne?
Echo a lot of what Mary Sue said. We do actually provide other discounts. I think in the federally regulated space in the transit world, we do have to, there's very specific criteria we have to evaluate in terms of services, which gets to why some people say, oh, that's inefficient. That's, there's sort of broader social equity and access questions that we have to deal with, so you don't always get to operate the most efficient transit system ever. And that's some of the trade-offs we have to make. I've had people come and say, you should be running this like a business. Well, it's not meant to run like a business. The transit system we have came from the private sector when they didn't want to and couldn't afford to run it any longer. And so we have to think more broadly about some of these social and economic factors in all the decisions we make in terms of service levels, fares, and coverage. So it's a challenge. I think we don't do it great. I think funding often becomes a big impediment to doing sort of better and more. But I do think I think we do a decent job. It doesn't mean we can't continue to improve and make sure we've got a very focused lens.
Well, to borrow from the previous panel, I would say that I think maybe Gia said it or whatnot, you have to meet people where they are. So in my first year and a half, I never denied anyone a meeting. Everybody has a plan for the port. And so I asked for them, and that whittled down as many people who said that they actually had a plan for the port. And we got them, and what I said was, if we lay everybody's plan on top of one another, I guarantee you we're probably going to find some commonality. And if we start from there, then we can move forward. You have to take everyone's desires into account, whether you like them or not, whether you want them or not. And like I said, my first year, I met with everyone who wanted a meeting. Now I won't be doing that my second year, but I'm just being honest. But right. I heard, but truly you have to meet people where you are, and you have to be, and if y'all truly knew me, you know how magnanimous this statement is. You got to be humble enough to understand that you don't know everything. So I'm the executive director, right? So I'm responsible for everything, but I don't know everything. So me taking a step back and listening to urban planners, which that's not my degree, me listening to the environmental advocates, the conservation, the industry folks, you got to bring it all together. And one of the things that we have done is we put out a 5-year plan. And in our 5-year plan, we have our ERIC initiative, and that deals with the environment and economics, recreation and resource, innovation and industry, and conservation and community. So it's meeting people where they are, recognizing you don't have all the answers, and then going back and incorporating what you've heard and learned.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. Local voices are clearly the most knowledgeable and powerful and most persuasive when it comes to creating change. They know their communities best, and so listening and making sure you've incorporated all that. And I think a good example from our perspective is in our work in some of the lower income communities in Chicago, we've what we often hear in terms of meeting people where they are is, gee whiz, A, there aren't enough good jobs nearby, and B, it's hard to get there by transportation, especially if you can't afford to own a car, right? Or you're not physically able to drive a car. So as much as we love biking at the Active Transportation Alliance, what we're hearing from a lot of our low-income communities is focus on transit, because that's far more people are going to use transit to get where they're going than ride a bike. And that may change someday, I hope it does, but that's where we are right now, right? And that's where they are. So for example, we've been working with the Metro Electric Coalition on the south side to try to persuade Metro and others, RTA, others to find a way to run that service more like a CTA-style service with closer stops, more frequent service. We think that could be a huge asset to the south side of Chicago. And this is something we're hearing from residents is better transit. But we also know that in the bigger picture, as long as the jobs keep going out to the suburbs, not near, in places that really aren't accessible by transit, we're going to continue to struggle to connect people, especially low-income populations, with these jobs. And we're hearing that loud and clear. And we're not going to resolve that problem solely by talking amongst ourselves in this room or talking about this foundation or that. Ultimately, that boils down to every single municipality in the region, the Illinois Department of Transportation, the governor, so on and so forth. And so I hope you'll keep that in mind when you hear Secretary Blankenhorn talk later on.
Seems like a good time to get into some audience questions. I think we have a mic for you, too.
Hello, okay, thank you. So Nicole Johnson, Southside native. We spoke about the cost of segregation in the last bit. One thing I would like to encourage the panel, particularly RTA and the Planning Council, is to possibly take an assessment of the bus stops, particularly where the buses stop, like in 8A, and then it picks up the 8. So I bring this up because there's a bus stop on 79th and Halsted, and I've been using it since '96 when I was living in Washington Heights and when I went to Inglewood. And it's been the same, right? It's not a safe space. The glass is like the glass that you can't see through. It's cloudy. So if we want people to use the public transportation, it has to be safe. It has to be well lit. It has to have benches. There should be a heating mechanism during the winter months because it's a gangway. It's in between two buildings, so it can get kind of cold there. So my suggestion would be to take assessment of those sites across the city, not necessarily ones that are in like Jackson and Van Buren, where they had that new one across the street from Union Station, the new port there. Like, we should have that all across the city so the CTA can be used as a quality form of transportation for all citizens and residents of the city.
Leanne, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I know CTA has a commitment to safety across their entire system. They do all regularly evaluate sort of the routes and the system. A lot of the shelters are actually contracted out through the city of Chicago, so there's kind of a relationship there. But I can certainly take that point back to CTA and specifically that location and have them take a look too.
More questions? You, sir? Who's looking around?
Should the city focus more on upgrading and expanding the Blue Line rather than try to build, even with private money, an express train to O'Hare that would probably degrade Blue Line service?
Well, the CTA is very much focused on Your New Blue, which is a very specific project to enhance the existing and improve the existing Blue Line. I'm not intimately engaged with the Airport Express, but from my understanding, maybe Mary Sue, you might have even had a bit more conversation, but that's actually kind of being run specifically out of the mayor's office as a way to look at, could they bring private equity investors in to build a separate service that would specifically serve that market. So it's not taking away from any investment or any dollars that we would have to invest into the existing infrastructure. The look is to look at new money. Now, whether that comes to fruition, it's been talked about for a long time. So I don't really have I don't think it's not taking away anything from the Blue Line and the enhancements that CTA is actually investing in along that line.
Questions for other members?
Quick addition to that is, Leanne's right that we have to make sure something new, a totally new service, expanded train to O'Hare would not detract resources from the ongoing maintenance. But we also have to market what we've got. I want a real-time signage at every gate that says time to traffic on the Kennedy, run it with the traffic reports, time to traffic, time to city on the CTA, and the price, $5, right there, so that people can make some choices. They don't have to hunt for where the train is at the O'Hare. They can make a decision about $30 versus $5 and time to time. And we have to market and help people get comfortable and familiar with our great service of the Blue Line.
We are beyond the threshold of major technological changes in transportation. And I was wondering if the panel could tell me what have we been doing about it, what should we be doing about it, how should we be thinking about it, and is there a danger in doing some major transit projects which may be outdated by the time they're built?
Well,
Ideas.
as far as, I'm not sure what technology you're referring to. There's a lot we could be discussing. If you're referring to autonomous vehicles, for example, okay. Sure. Well, let me kind of focus first on the whole kind of new mobility services, quote unquote, combined with autonomous vehicles. The Transit Center out of New York did a nice report recently making the case that, and I think this is true, that none of those services are going to ultimately replace public transportation. They may actually dovetail with and become a part of public transportation, but we're going to still need public transportation. Certainly we're not going to be able to move nearly, you just physically can't move the number of people we move on public transportation in, personal automobiles that hold like 3 or 4 or 5 people. So having said that, we also know that these new mobility services, there's pretty strong indications that they are eating into public transportation ridership in Chicago and elsewhere. It's not 100% sure, but it looks pretty likely. And so we're all trying to kind of grapple with what that looks like. And I know that the mayor's office and others are looking at policies to address that. So I'm going to stop there and let others maybe talk about the other technologies that you were referring to.
I think we can let Randy do that next.
Right.
I see him standing in the wings.
Yeah, there you go.
I should say Secretary of Transportation.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
Do you have
okay.
a board question?
No, no.
Okay. So,
Clayton, you have to answer it, whatever it is.
yeah, you have to answer it,
I used to
Clayton.
be over at IDOT and CDOT. I can
there
talk
you
about
go.
transportation, but I figured you want the experts, and I'm cool just sitting here.
Well, questions for Rob and Mary Sue particularly. I got here today via rail and bike from the suburbs.
Me too.
Yeah, from McHenry County. I am infinitely safer bicycling in downtown Chicago than I am in the suburbs. And I don't know how we have, on our major thoroughfares, we have miles and miles of strip malls that aren't connected with any kind of a pedestrian and bicycle frontage. Well, if you get to one of those giant strip malls and you want to go in, there's no safe pedestrian and bicycle route to get into them. We have sidewalks downtown. I've literally seen 200-foot long strips of sidewalk that start and end nowhere. Yep. There's very little coordination. So at what level are you advocating across counties and within municipalities as a part of those counties for better?
Sure.
I mean, we do have pace buses now. I almost ran off the road the first time I saw one, so I was pretty excited about that. But
That's funny. Well, yeah, Active Transportation Alliance, we put out our Suburban Bikeways for All report just a few weeks ago. Check that out. It kind of lays out the key ingredients for how suburbs can make their communities more friendly for cycling. It's all the things you would probably imagine, like don't do the things you just described, for example, or try to retrofit, because that's a lot of what we're going to have to do in the suburbs is retrofitting. They've just been so built up around cars and cars only, and so there's a lot of retrofitting that needs to happen. There are opportunities around the more downtown areas and like in the metro stations where it's relatively low-hanging fruit. You can do some things. But otherwise, there's a lot of retrofitting that needs to happen in the suburbs to bring destinations closer together, to create mixed uses, right? And as opposed to these separated uses that are the hallmark of suburbs, offices over here, homes over there, shopping over here, separated by miles of pavement. It's a mess. That's sprawl, right? It's the definition of sprawl. But as far as transit goes, yeah, we're really excited about, PACE is doing some cool things now around express bus service, and we've been working with them on that. Ultimately, we're going to need to find a way to move our buses faster, get our destinations closer together, move our buses faster, because expanding rail is expensive and not something we can do in the near term, but improving bus service is something we definitely can do in the suburbs as well as the city.
Your question is great because it touches on different modes. Some of them are of the low-cost variety that Ron talked about before. I think we should have a photo contest of everyone here and to send in, the dilapidated bus shelter on 79th or the lack of sidewalk bus stop or bike access. And if we say in the context of the bigger package, the much, much bigger package, that we're going to dedicate a portion to these kinds of things, that's something that people can get excited about and start to think about what's possible. Also, our tollways, in addition to our interstates, can and should be designed to accommodate transit in the right-of-way, whether it's the bus on shoulder initiatives on the Stevenson or others. There's clear demand in suburban corridors for dedicated transit service. In the past, it's been a self-fulfilling prophecy of saying, well, we can't provide the service because there's not many people in the suburbs that ride transit in certain corridors. And of course, we make it very hard. So if we made it easier, we'd have a real sense of what the demand is.
I think we have time for one more question. Ma'am, you've got the microphone.
Check, 1, 2, okay. Thank you. Miles, Veronica Williams here, former reporter for WBZ. Glad you came from Wyoming. glad that I paved the way for a great reporter like yourself to do such a great job. Tori Malatia will be very proud of you. Thank you so much, Clayton, CalSAG Channel, and everything you do with the port. And thank you also, Ron. I'm a biker enthusiast. Growing up with Michelle Obama in South Shore High Park, of course, you have to love biking in the city. For Mary Sue, many senior citizens on the South Side, senior lady citizens, loved the Seniors Ride Free program. They appreciate that great program. Quite a few of them in my church enjoy the program immensely. And to
I'm
Leanne,
for it. I think it should go to the people who need it.
yeah, people who need it,
Yep.
definitely on the South and West Side, you know, brown and blacks, yes. Leanne, what we'd like to know, we are graduate students here at Chicago State University, and the 95th Red Line extension, which is part of RTA, which will be extended, I do believe, to 130th Allgale Gardens. What is the timeline on the completion of the Red Line, 95th Street Red Line extension on the south side of Chicago?
So there's no final big timeline, deadline. The challenge is the proverbial, the thing we've been underlying everything today, funding. CTA is moving forward with planning. They are in the process of doing the draft EIS of that corridor to do the environmental work, a precursor to basically line up all the work that has to happen to when we get to the point, or if we can find the money to do that, so they could advance that project. So they're taking the approach of sort of chipping away at this, sort of each step of the federal process as they can when monies are available. Dorval Carter is very committed to the project and has really done a lot. Coming out of FTA, well, being CTA and then going to FTA, he's really good at knowing the inner workings and how to sort of leverage monies and advance some of these projects. So that's the status. When is it being built? There is no commitment to those timelines specifically yet, unfortunately.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and joining me up here. Keynote speaker is coming up next, so stick around.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that panel. You can step down now. Yeah, thank you. The theme, or at least the theme I heard, was the resources aren't there. I just returned from Washington, where we released a study on the condition of America's cities, of their financial position. And if you think it's tight now, it's only going to get tighter. So that's the takeaway. Well, our keynote speaker to close the program is Randy Blankenhorn, who served as the Illinois Transportation Secretary under Governor Bruce Rauner since 2015. He leads an agency of 10 offices that serve the needs of the state. He oversees $3 billion in operating budget, 4,800 employees, and $3.4 billion in capital projects. And it's all listed, I think, in your program. Prior to his being selected as the IDOT Secretary, he was the first appointed director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. He is a tireless public servant committed to improving the transportation system of the state, to access and to equity, and a longtime urban forum supporter. Randy?
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. Wow, this is a little loud. Thanks for having me. I hope the forum has been going well today. It's always an important event for our region, for our communities, to talk about the future of our urban communities and what they look like and what we need to do together to think about it. The focus today has been a lot on infrastructure, which is, I guess, why I'm here. But it's more than that. It's thinking about the future in new and different ways. I think you heard some of that before. I've been asked to talk about two things today. One is a little bit of what's going on in Washington. For those of us that watch it, we still aren't sure exactly what's happening, but I'll try to give you the overview as I know it. And then a little bit more about what we're thinking about when we talk about soft infrastructure versus hard infrastructure. When we talk about community development versus economic development, what are the things that we're trying to do as a department and honestly as a transportation industry? Starting at the federal side, a $1 trillion program might be a $1 trillion program depending on how you look at it. We're not waiting for this to happen. There's a lot of moving parts, but I do believe that this administration is interested in more funding, in more creative funding for infrastructure in general and transportation in specifics. The thing that has helped me through this the most is that they have really reached out to state and local officials to talk about what does this program need to look like? How does it work? Because the federal government doesn't implement these programs. State and local governments do. And honestly, this is the first time in my long career in the transportation world where I feel they have actually been interested in what we have to say. Past administrations have invited us to Washington or called us, and it felt like they were checking a box. Yes, we talked to the state officials. Yes, we talked to the regional officials. I didn't feel like it was a meaningful conversation. I believe in this case that state and local officials are going to drive what this program looks like, and I think that's a first. So from that perspective, I'm very happy. There are 4 tenets of this infrastructure proposal that they have out there, and when they first came out, in a lot of ways, we said at IDOT, we could have written these ourselves because they are the things that we believe in. We believe in targeted federal investment. There's only going to be so much more federal money, and that's just a fact of where it comes from. I am a firm believer in raising the gas tax at the federal level. I've talked to our congressional people about it for over a decade. Usually they tell me, Randy, we're right behind you. The problem is they need to be in front of me. They need to be pushing this, but there is no appetite today to do something like that. I believe an appetite will come, but it isn't today. And so we have to figure new and creative ways to do that. I think we have to think about what is the federal role in transportation. If they don't deliver, if in fact, if you look at all transportation funding, it's about 30 cents of every dollar is federal. Where is the federal role? What is the federal responsibility? And how do we compare that to then what do we take on as state, local, and private industries? How do we think about this in a new way? That's an important thing for us to talk about. We have new flexible funding, competitive funding programs. The infra program, which I'll talk about a little later, really is an opportunity for them to focus. And we have said to them on and on and on again, we have a great project for that I'll mention, but you need to focus federal resources. Spreading those competitive grants across 50 states in a way that doesn't get anything major done is not an effective use of federal funds. If the best projects happen to be in Arizona or Massachusetts or California, fine. I don't like that, but fine. I think that's how you need to be thinking about a federal program, is really solving real federal problems, national problems. And honestly, when we are the transportation hub of North America, a lot of those transportation problems are here. So we think we can compete very well in that. The second principle that they have is what they're calling encouraging self-help. I would call it putting skin in the game. I think that we have to figure out how state and local governments, and particularly here in Illinois, how we are going to put more of our own funding into projects. It used to be federal funds would come and 80% of it would be federal and 20% of it would be local, and that's how you built things. Those days are over. Those days are gone. We need to find new creative ways to raise resources locally. Locally in the cities, locally in our regions, locally at the state level, to not only match federal funds, but to drive federal funding decisions. A lot of what we heard is that they would like to use new funding to be the last dollars in at the federal level, not the first dollars in. Close the gap. How do we use federal money to close the gaps that we have at our state and local levels? And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think it has to come with a new relationship between the federal government and our states and local governments. The third is to align investment with entities that actually can get something done. And the best example I can give isn't a highway or transit, it's actually in our waterways. We forget that waterways are a huge part of our transportation system. I hope you heard from our panel from Clayton that they need to be a bigger piece of our transportation system. But we have locks and dams that are owned and operated by the Corps of Engineers. They're not actually capable of delivering the kind of enhancements and rehabilitations that we need. How do we use the process that they've created and actually create entities that can get these things done? There's actually money sitting in places on our harbors that isn't being used because we can't get projects done. That's a shame. And so I think this idea of how do we talk about new entities that can deliver is a good way to think about a federal role. The last is, and is unusual that any of you haven't heard it, and you probably heard it in the previous panels, is how do we leverage private investment? There is a role for private investment in our infrastructure systems. From our waterways to our water and sewer to our parks to transportation, there is a role here. But it is not the answer. And I think we have all made that clear for years that public-private partnerships are a tool. They are not a golden bullet that is going to solve all of our problems for us. There are opportunities that they make perfect sense, and I'll talk about a couple of those, but there are most of them that they don't. And so we still have to talk about federal, state, and local resources that do the day-to-day things that we need to do that I'm sure Leanne talked about. How do we maintain what we have? You're not going to privatize maintenance of a highway or a rail line. It's just not feasible at this point in time. There has to be regular funding sources that allow us to do what needs to be done. I also spent, while I was at CMAP, at least a year in Washington talking to our lawmakers and their staffs about the difference between funding and financing. They are two completely different things. And we think that if we provide capital and cash, if we provide capital opportunities, then we've solved our problems. We don't need new financing mechanisms in Illinois. We know how to borrow money in Illinois. We don't know how to pay it back, but we know how to borrow money in Illinois. We need solid revenue streams that we can count on year after year, maybe not for the big new stuff, but for our day-to-day maintenance of our existing system. And when we talk about additions to our system, we are truly talking about on the margins. Particularly here in Chicagoland, we have the system that we're going to have over the next 20 years. Might we add a lane here or there? Yes. Might we add a transit extension here or there? Yes. But these are going to be small percentages of the overall system. We have to work with our federal partners so that they understand there is not a financing problem, there is a revenue problem, and we've got to find a way to deal with that. So while P3s are just one tool, they are a valuable tool, and we have tried to find ways to make that work. We have a proposal to add a managed lane on I-55, that the existing lanes would stay free, that give people an opportunity to pay into a system that gets them downtown in a specific amount of time or back to the suburbs. There is no opposition to this. They're happening all over the world. This isn't a new idea. I talk to our people about being innovative all the time, and much of what we think is innovation is actually happening all over this country and all over this world, and we're just behind the times. Managed lanes is one of those. We need to try it here in Illinois. The Stevenson Expressway seems to be the right way to do it. Unfortunately, we have not had the cooperation of the General Assembly to let us move this forward, which is really a shame. We're going to continue to fight for it. We're going to continue to move it. But part of my interest in I-55 is we have to do something on the Eisenhower. I had a meeting today with the chairman of the tollway this morning. He was about 40 minutes late sitting on the Eisenhower. And I said, you should know better, man. This is what it is. But we've got to find a way not only to make it work better, and I think congestion pricing can come into play in that kind of a scenario, but we've got to find a way to rebuild it. And I think that there is an opportunity there through a public-private partnership to do that. But our feeling is we've got to try congestion pricing on the Stevenson before we attempt it on what is maybe the most congested highway in the United States, which is the Eisenhower. So there's a series of things that we have to go through. Another one that we've talked about a lot that I think people forget is truly a public-private partnership is CREATE. Our rail program that is a series of 70-plus projects that includes rail, not only freight rail, but passenger and Amtrak movement through this region, started as maybe the first big public-private partnership in America. It was a way for us to leverage freight industry money to solve common problems. And I think this is an example of how we need to think about where is that leverage that the federal government likes to talk about. How do we think about leveraging private money, not necessarily to pay for it all, but to be the piece that gets us going, that then we can find the public funding to make the rest of it work. I talked about the infra program, which is a competitive program that the USDOT is now running. We have an incredibly good project that we think is going to fare very well in the 75th Street Corridor Improvement Program, where we have significant conflicts between freight rail, Metra, Amtrak, and our highway system. This is honestly maybe the biggest pinch point for freight and passenger rail in the country. This is not a Chicago problem. This is not an Illinois problem. This is a national problem, and we think this program is the way to fund that. And we are, at this point, asking for less than a third of the money to come from the federal government. We're going to raise money locally. We're going to raise money through the railroads. This is, I think, when they talk about targeting federal resources and leveraging other money, we think this is what the federal government's talking about, and we think we have a great chance to make that work. But there's also smaller opportunities. We tend to look at the big picture of public-private partnerships, and we don't think about what are truly public-private partnerships in other places. You know, if you look at some of our Rails to Trails program, the 606, the Prairie Path, these are incredibly successful programs that we have delivered, and the city has delivered, and this region has delivered, that were in combination with an owner of a private railroad. These are the things that we have to continue to look at, is how do we leverage not only cash, but the private resources that can come in other ways. And I think we have many more opportunities than just tolling the expressway system. I think there are ways to do this that are going to move projects along that you and I care about much quicker and in a much better way. The second piece of this is we're talking about hard infrastructure versus soft infrastructure. And I will tell you that the line to me is incredibly blurred. I don't think that there is necessarily such a thing as a definition between hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Rails to Trails is another. It's just a great opportunity to think about how do we use existing infrastructure? How do we reuse existing infrastructure in ways that impact communities and make the social fabric of our communities better? You know, from the High Line in New York to the Rail Park in Philly to the Prairie Path, the 606, the Paseo, the Englewood line here in Chicago area, these are incredible successes that we have already started to take for granted. They're not easy to do. They take a lot of work. But I would ask, are these transportation corridors? Are they recreation corridors? Are they opportunities for educational programs? Are they opportunities for public art? And the answer to all of those is yes. We have to think about this in that way. We often think about the soft infrastructure as being about community development and hard infrastructure being about economic development. I don't think that's true at all. I think that transportation and other infrastructure is about the soft side. It is about the social fabric of our communities. It is about that community development. And honestly, what we used to think of as soft infrastructure drives local economies. It gives economies a chance to grow in ways that we hadn't thought about before. Look at the Riverwalk here in Chicago. You know, I walk that just about every day home. So for me, it's a transportation corridor. But there is so much going on there, so much good and positive that's happening from the retail and social side to the recreational side to just using the river in a different way that we hadn't thought about for years. It was an untapped resource, and look at the gem that it's become. So how do we as transportation professionals think about this? You know, we've gone from ignoring the soft side, which we did for a long, long time, to right now I think our attitude is we need to accommodate. We need to accommodate transit. We need to accommodate bikes and pedestrians. We need to accommodate community development. And for transportation professionals, honestly, that was a big step. But that's not the right step. It's not about accommodation, it's about incorporation. How do we incorporate this from beginning to end in how we are thinking about a transportation and what its role is? For those of you that have known me for a while, you've heard this before, transportation is only about two things. It's about how we strengthen our communities, and it's how we grow our economies. That's all it's about. People don't care whether we are adding a lane, extending a transit line. In and of itself, it has no value. It's what value does it bring to our local communities? What value does it bring to our local economies? How do we use transportation in those ways? And that's something, since we've gotten here at IDOT, that we've really tried to do. So where does that end? Where does that soft and hard end? I don't think it does, and I don't think it should. I really think that we have to look to bring more opportunities into how we look at transportation investment as a way to do more than just getting cars, trucks, and buses from here to there. It is about connecting communities. It is about getting access. There are two huge examples that I want to talk about quickly because I'm going to get the cutoff sign that really give us an opportunity to think differently and do things differently. One is the Eisenhower Expressway that I mentioned earlier that Bob Schillerstrom had to sit on. When we built that 50 years ago, we separated communities. We drove communities apart, and we have an opportunity in the rebuild of that to fix it. How do we provide not just accommodation, but how do we incorporate transit into our thinking as we rebuild the Eisenhower? How does that access to transit work better? How do we think about reconnecting communities by using plazas on our overpasses, by allowing opportunities for parks and retail and other things that connect communities across the Eisenhower to do it in a way that is attractive, that isn't just a bridge that people want to walk out, but is actually a draw in and of itself. We have an opportunity to rethink the way that we do this, and I tell our staff, this is our chance to be a truly 21st century expressway, and we cannot let this opportunity go away. The second is Lakeshore Drive. I think that traditional engineers, if you would ask them, would rebuild Lakeshore Drive just as it is today. That can't be what we do. How do we think about just the entire corridor that is the lakefront? How do we think about the bicycle and pedestrian activity that goes on? How do we think about connecting the parks? How do we think about moving people in a different way on Lakeshore Drive? All of these things have to be a consideration. Our team, when we started talking with the City of Chicago and our other partners about what we were going to do, they narrowed the options too far, in my opinion, and they said, these other options are too expensive. My answer was, we don't have the money that it takes today to do this. We have to think bigger. We have to think about an ultimate solution that is going to take this jewel of a lakefront and make it work for everybody, not just transportation commuters and people that are using it for transportation purposes. We've got to make it work for everybody. And I think a month or so ago, you saw some drawings that came out in the newspapers that showed a new way of thinking about what we're trying to do with Lakeshore Drive and other projects. Transportation agencies have to change. We have to think differently about what we're about. I have spent 2.5 years talking a lot about how we plan for the past. We plan for yesterday. Yesterday's transportation system is not tomorrow's transportation system. The goals of yesterday's transportation system are not the goals of tomorrow's transportation system. I heard the technology question. It's going to change the world in ways that we haven't even always thought about. We have to start thinking differently. We have to be more creative, from everything from funding to project delivery. We have to have broader participation in the way we do business. We have to talk to people more about what it means to them, what it means to their community, what it means for their quality of life, what it means for the social fabric of where we are today. That's what transportation needs to be doing, not just moving people and goods from here to there. Illinois was the most innovative DOT in the country at one time. We are on our way to getting there again, but change is hard. I tell people, my assistant secretary says it best. He says, the easiest thing for a bureaucrat to say is no. You never get in trouble saying no. We've got to find ways to get to yes. We've got to find ways to rethink what we are all about, what tomorrow's transportation system is, what we're trying to accomplish, and where we're trying to go. I'll close with a conversation that I had with a former secretary when I was at IDOT the first time, and I said, transportation is not a goal. Transportation is a strategy. It's a strategy for other social, economic, and community goals, and we've got to stop thinking about it like that. And he stopped the car and asked me to get out. But truly, that is where we have to be. Transportation in and of itself is not a goal. It's a strategy to the bigger picture things that we are all trying to do to make this city, to make this region, to make this state great. And I look forward to continuing to try to move IDOT forward. So thank you very much, and I guess I have time for a couple of questions. Thank you. Not him. Yeah, I do.
You indicated that we're behind in this country and the rest of the world. And I'd like to give you an example that might be helpful here. 40 years ago, I had the opportunity to run a subsidiary of a U.S. company in Europe. And we were located in Cologne, Germany. I lived 2 blocks from the Rhine River, and along the river was a 4-lane boulevard that I needed to drive to get to my office. It was about 7 kilometers away, and every kilometer there was a T-shaped intersection so cars can enter and exit this 4-lane boulevard. And of course they had traffic lights at these intersections. Well, the unique thing was about halfway between the traffic lights were digital signals to tell you how fast you should drive so you'll catch the next green light. And this would reduce fuel consumption, emissions, congestion, and stress. Now, I made this recommendation to the Chicago Department of Transportation a number of years ago, and the response was something like, "Don't bother us, we have more important things to do." I experienced this 40 years ago, and I don't know how many years before that they had it in Germany. Maybe that's something that we could try in smaller towns, and then if it works, bring it to Chicago.
I get what you're saying, and I think that there is value in knowing where you are in a system and how that works. I will tell you that as I watch, not just in the city, but in the suburbs and in downstate Illinois, as I watch our pedestrian countdown clocks go down, I see people speed up. And that causes me a safety concern. There is somewhere in the middle that we have to be talking about. How do we get traffic to flow more freely so we reduce congestion, so we reduce emissions? That is the goal. How do we do it in a way that doesn't impact safety, which is honestly at this point our biggest concern, is something that we're going to have to deal with. But I think it's a legitimate way to think about how we look in the future about trying something new. IDOT has been afraid for the last decade to fail. We have not tried projects that we think might work, because if they don't work, the Tribune headline is going to be IDOT is idiots. We've got to get rid of that mentality. We have to try things. And we have to understand that it's okay to fail. The first thing that we told our team when we came in was, if you're not making any mistakes, you're not thinking hard enough. You have to try things. You have to let them fail at times. And we've got to get that, what I say, that mojo back, where we're willing to do it. And we're willing to say, okay, that didn't work. Why didn't it work? What can we do differently? And how do we then make it work? So we have to find ways to think of these new kind of ideas and implement them in a, call it a pilot, call it whatever you want, but we've got to try things differently. Doing it the way we've always done it is not going to work. I'm going to let them pick who they're...
Thank you for coming in and speaking to us today. My question is, saying that you've spoken with the federal level and there's no appetite for increase in the federal gas tax, in your experience, is there an appetite for any source of revenue at either state or local level that you would see actually occurring here to help some of this funding issue, which seems to be a reoccurring problem?
Yeah, I would say at the state level, there is an appetite for new funding for transportation. We've talked a lot about, at the state level, what we need to do. And whether it's a gas tax increase or it's something else, for those of you that know me, I'm a user pays believer. I believe users of a system pay for a system. As long as it follows that user pay philosophy, I don't actually care very much where the revenue comes from. The last 2 revenue capital programs we've had in Illinois for infrastructure, particularly for transportation, have been borrowing money. There hasn't been new revenue that comes in. And what we have told the legislature, what we've told the governor and the governor's office is, we need long-term sustainable funding that is going to take care of our day-to-day needs. I don't mind borrowing money for a big brand new project that's going to last 50 years. That makes sense to me. I mind borrowing for 30 years for a project that's going to last 8. And that's what we're doing right now, and we've got to get away from it. So I do believe that if we can get the politics right, there is an appetite for new infrastructure spending in Springfield. And I believe it will come sooner rather than later. When that is, I would be totally guessing. But rank and file members of the General Assembly, this administration in Springfield believes that we have to invest more in our infrastructure. One more here. Hi.
Thanks for your talk. So, innovation. Is the department doing any analysis of autonomous vehicles and how you'll need to respond to it?
We are. We are very much looking at what is the state's role in this? How does the state play a role? There have been a couple of attempts, for example, here in the city of Chicago to ban autonomous vehicles. That's not what we need to be doing. We need to make sure we're doing it right. And so IDOT has actually convened a task force of state agencies to talk about this, because it's not only IDOT, it's state police, it's the Secretary of State who does licensing, it's the Department of Insurance. I had this conversation with the national insurance industry about, if there is an accident, where is fault? Is it a driver? Is it the vehicle? You guys need to figure this out before we get to that point where we have fully self-driving vehicles. Our philosophy is pretty simple at IDOT on this, is that one, we need to provide opportunities for testing. And we think a lot of our opportunities for testing are in the commercial vehicle area, in the trucks. We are a truck hub here. We think that makes us different than other states that don't have this kind of freight activity, and we want to work with companies that want to do testing here in Illinois. The second is that we want to provide the academic and other research capacity here in Illinois that exists. I gave a speech probably 2 years ago and said I wanted activity about automated vehicles to be happening here. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, so I'd like to take you to our guy that we got working on this in Michigan and talk to him about it. I said, no, I want your Michigan guy and all his work to come to Illinois. We need to provide an atmosphere where we have the academic and research capacity that already exists, and we focus it in this area. The third is we can't get ahead of ourselves on regulation. We've seen states that have done that have discouraged testing and other opportunities. We have to do this in a way that's safe. It is IDOT's biggest concern, but we also can't regulate what we don't know. And there's a big attempt to try to do that. So I think our position is, as a department, one, this is coming. Automated vehicles are coming. It is not the Jetsons. It's going to happen. And we need to be, most of you are too young to know the Jetsons reference. We need to be a fully engaged partner in how to make it work best for the state, best for the traveling public, best for our communities in a way that's truly safe. So I'm getting the stop sign. Thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Randy, for bridging community development and economic development. Very nice. The box lunch is behind you. Take one as you leave, or take one to one of the rooms to eat. But before you go, I want to thank numerous people who made this event possible, especially Jenny Sweeney, who's organized this for 6 years now, Norma Ramos, Brian Flood, Jennifer Woodard, Jantel Hines, and Casey Sabetti. Special thanks to the white paper authors, Phil Ashton, Charlie Hoke, Sanji Vidyarthi, Beverly Bunch, and Sean Lally. And of course to our panelists and our keynote speakers, and Randy. Thanks to all of you. Be sure to fill out your evaluation forms. It's your ideas that help shape the UIC Urban Forums. We look forward to seeing you in 2018. Thank you.